have any like big news to share, or do you want to just make an announcement? Sometimes we try to do like community things before we get kicked off. Does anyone have anything to share? Hey, this guy has something to share. Look at it. Looks so intense. This company just got bought.
Yeah, my company just got acquired by APP last week. So my first experience being in a company from startup to exit, so pretty cool experience.
Before we begin, I want to thank Charles, please.
Oh, I got it, Mark.
No, stand up. Please make an announcement, please.
Daily Pay will be announcing our Series B next week, so stay tuned for that as well.
Completion of. Okay. It's already been announced, but finish it. Make sure you get that completed. It's kind of like the deal, like announcing a deal before the deal actually yanks. Oh my goodness! I've actually experienced that before. We want to make it interactive. Tonight we want to talk about this whole idea of how do we actually build pipeline. Sometimes we all struggle in that, finding the time, figuring out how to do it. So I have some questions I'm going to start us off with, but please feel free. This is your time as well. So throw over some questions. As I said, there's no bad questions. There may be some off-topic questions, but it could be a little bit more concise. But definitely ask. And hopefully by the end of the session we can all be a little bit smarter around how to build rapport and have a very healthy pipeline as we start off the year. So, welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Would you like to introduce yourselves? Who wants to go first?
All right. Hey, I'm Cole Fox. I'm with Regal Sagemount and portfolio operations. What that means is we go and help our portfolio companies. And yes, I was recently at Lead IQ. I left. I know you're giving me a weird look. He's one of the customers at a company I was just at, which was a prospecting tool. It's a great tool, by the way. But yeah, Regal Sagemount has a portfolio of companies, and I run around to their companies and help them with their sales excellence. So we can then flip those companies like houses and sell them. So I do everything from sales management to hiring people to anything under the sun sales to help them sell more and be predictable.
Great, and Jason Robinson. I'm VP of Sales at Calibra, which is headquartered about 5 minutes from here on Broadway. Data governance company. We just announced our Series D. Have some great members of the team. We're really excited to have them here supporting me today, so thank you for coming. Thanks for everyone for coming. My history, I've spent about 15 years in sales productivity, sales effectiveness, technologies, and now I'm bringing that into Calibra. I've been there for about 6 months. I'm really excited to be here tonight with you guys, so thanks for having me.
So we're just going to jump right in. Prospecting. How do you actually get in the door these days? Because I got to tell you, I'm a salesperson, but I still get emails all the time, and they're just generally terrible. So what are you doing that might be uniquely different to try and get the attention of folks who just honestly probably don't want to be reached out to? And I'll let Jason kick us off.
Yeah, sure. I'm not going to sit here and say that there's a secret sauce necessarily. I mean, I think we've all experimented with different things. I think there was a school of thought for a long time that it was all about volume. And I think you're seeing the pendulum swing back to how do you manage the tension between great quality and volume. And quality for me means a bunch of different things, but the biggest thing for me is relevance. I think there's a lot of content that comes across that is not relevant to buyers, and that really turns them off very quickly. So how do you make it personal, relevant, and ultimately how do you do that in a way that gets their attention? So an example I saw last week to me, which I thought was great, was a rep who spent the time thinking about my company in the competitive space and actually named my competitors in the email. And immediately, that's the world I'm in. That's what I'm thinking about every day. It's the battle I'm fighting. So it gets my attention and makes me wonder, should I be talking to these people? So, relevance is important. I think, being personable is important. Being genuine is important in terms of messaging. And then, as I think about the cadence is important. I mean, if you're just doing email, you're not going to get people's attention. So how do you mix it up? And how do you use different channels to get to folks? There's something called the phone that I still believe works, and actually can get people's attention today, more so than you may have seen in the past, just because no one's calling them. So I think it's a mix of those things, at least at the highest level.
Yeah, to echo that, I think it's definitely a mix. It's a diversification of outreach efforts. There's tools that can support you with that, literally called outreach. And I think it's a combo of kind of this foundation of like you want the right technology in place to help you do these things, like personalize at scale, be able to write a message, add a little personalization, fire it off, add it into a flow. So you want to at least start there, and there's a lot of people who can kind of give you that foundation out there, and if you need help, I'm happy to point you in that direction. I'm big on the technology side. I also came from a sales technology firm, but I think getting that in place and then getting, just that, a little bit of personalization at scale, but also essentially like, you just want to make sure that you can, get the attention of people, but do it at scale. So that's what I'd say.
Maybe can we dig in a little bit on that? Because I think we all hear like this idea, oh, we gotta personalize. I gotta tell you, like, what are we personalizing? I mean, how much time should we spend, on the research? Because I think sometimes you get research paralysis almost.
Yeah, one specific tactic I can give you guys is like, for example, G2 Crowd. So there's reviews online, and so what we did at Lead IQ when I was there is we would look at all of our competitors. We would look at the reviewers, and then we would reach out to those people and say, hey, I noticed you reviewed this tool, so we thought that you might be interested in us for this reason. So that was a trigger that was like, all right, well, this person kind of personalized this for me, but there were so many people reviewing that software. It's like thousands of people for like Salesforce, like we had an integration with Salesforce. So it's like, okay, I just sent 4,000 people an email. It did take time to mine that data a little bit, and be careful about scraping websites, by the way, but essentially like, the web, it can be your oyster these days. You can see a lot of data on people, and you can get relevant information pretty easily. And so use that to your advantage. It might take a little creativity, it might take a little time, but things like that can be helpful to get that trigger, that kernel that is enough to make somebody, like Jason, say, oh, this person did take a little time, or this is relevant to me, this is interesting to me, rather than just what I call showing up and throwing up, which you can do in an email, not just a presentation, just just like pitching your product. So starting out with like, hey, I noticed you use this technology, by the way, we integrate with that, or this is how customers have switched over to them, from them to us. So start that conversation in a way that's meaningful, even, there's some ways you can do it at scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's ways you can do it at scale with technology, and there's also ways you can do it at scale with sort of good old-fashioned elbow grease. And one of the ways that I think about that is, if you have a bit of a strategy as you go into your prospecting, and you think about, the customer that you're selling into, and you think about the personas within that customer, and you think about, the segments that customer is in, and you're thinking about that matrix, for lack of a better word, right? So in each of those, points of, as each of those come together, you can think about, hey, in this industry, here are the 2 or 3 things that if I get it into the note, or if I say it on the phone, it's going to resonate. And all of a sudden, you've got 1,000 contacts that you can go out to with something that's a little bit more relevant for them. And it takes you stepping back and putting some thought and elbow grease and getting a team together and brainstorm it. But once you do it, you've got that content and you can reuse it. So that's one of the plays that we run. We run sort of industry and then persona in terms of who buys from us, and we think about what's relevant for that person that I can just add to, whether it's an outbound email or a reach out through LinkedIn or a phone call.
So I think sometimes on the persona side, the feeling is in some companies they kind of throw it over the wall to marketing. But do you believe how involved does sales, or should they get involved in terms of the personas and some of that messaging?
It depends on how good your marketing is, right? So if we make our living day to day, week to week, month to month, quarter to quarter. So you can wait for marketing to help, or you can lean in and get it done and show marketing the way. We've got great marketing at Calibra. They help us out a lot. I've been in places where you just got to roll up your sleeves and get it done.
Yeah, so let's dig in a lot, because I think we can have maybe the best process for reaching out to folks, but if we're not reaching out to the right folks with the right message, then it's all for naught. You've done a lot of work for nothing. In fact, I mean, I've gotten emails here at Stack by people wanting to pitch me on a bunch of tea they want to, or snacks. I'm like, I'm not the right person. I'm not the person who buys the snacks and the drinks for the office, right? So, you know, on one hand, it's like the wrong persona, the wrong person. I'm not the buyer. The other thing I see is that particularly with large companies, you know, so a lot of folks here are selling enterprise. Like who like has that classic enterprise sales, big Fortune 500? You know, so there's a few of us here, and it's kind of a mystery to figure out. And this company has like 50 CIOs. Like, who do you really reach out to? They're going to maybe talk about just the persona part, and then we can back that into messaging.
Yeah, there was a specific circumstance. I used to work for LinkedIn, and I was in the recruiting solutions department a long time ago, like 2010. And what we did is we brought in our persona. Like we literally brought in like our top customer, and our head of sales just interviewed the heck out of them. Like, basically, what do you eat for breakfast every morning? It got pretty hairy. So it was one of those cases where our sales team was armed with a repertoire of, you know, now I can make an email template. I can kind of like sort of run some jazz on like these emails that are gonna be relevant to that recruiting director, that VP of talent. So the more you can get into their head and their day to day, you know, they're gonna respond. Like what is keeping Jason up at night, right? Like he wants higher sales numbers, he wants more predictability. Okay, well if you know that about him, what's stopping you from starting your email off with that very thing about his day-to-day job and how to make him better about that?
Yeah, another interesting example, and you know, it's personal for me. I was sitting in a QBR at the beginning of this month, and in that QBR, I got an email asking me how my QBR was going. And it's not, you know, obviously they don't have perfect intelligence, but they know generally this is a time of year when guys like me are thinking about things like that. It just so happened I got the email in the actual meeting, so that's pretty relevant, you know. And it's just that
was it Facebook? Are they spying on you?
I don't know. I'm not sure where they're getting their data from, but no, it's that level of relevance, and sometimes a bullet hits a bullet, and that's part of the game, right? So you're doing volume, but you have enough of valuable content that a bullet hits a bullet, and you get people's attention.
So you figure out who you're trying to reach out to. And you got like the persona down. You know kind of the things that they care about. So what about that messaging though? Because I'll be honest, I think I've seen a lot of really bad like emails, just bad writing in general. So what are you doing to kind of make it interesting? Because if you're going to send something, it's got to grab their attention, right? And that's the biggest challenge with anything which is not related to a phone. With a phone, you get the person or not. You can get something going, I think, generally. Particularly like things like LinkedIn, email. What are you doing that's kind of a little bit different or you're trying to capture that attention right off the bat?
Well, again, technology can be your friend in this case, where you're sort of running this like net and a spear at once. And what I mean by that is like, for example, you send an email out to a fair amount of people, but then you're doing a little more digging before that task comes up where you actually call them. And you're looking at their LinkedIn at that point. So they're kind of aware, right? You're casting this wide net, but then like that call is gonna be super personalized. You're like, you've looked at their LinkedIn, you know that they like Cheetos, eating Cheetos late at night, so you like call them, you start with that. I don't know about that, but anyway, point being is that you're diversifying your outreach in a way that's got a good process, that's scalable, but you're also adding in that personalization. You're treating them like a human. Just remember, we're all humans here. And so those are some of the ways that we can cheat the system a little bit, where you're running this play that a lot of people know about you, but now then you're zeroing in on their actual attention to then get that next step. So that's the way I've seen it done pretty well.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think, and you've got to think about a sequence of communication too. So, you know, generally the way that I like to do it is you start with the reason why you're reaching out and the value you can deliver, because ultimately for a lot of executives that's what it comes down to. And you got to think about obviously who you're doing that with, but the business value of them taking the call. But then, you know, I think you can think about, you know, the personal relationship that you might have with them relative to similar interests, and you can think about the referenceability of your relationships to theirs as you look at LinkedIn and figure out how you're connected. And each of those messages has a little bit of a different tone, so ultimately you hook into something that that's going to catch their attention, they're going to respond to. And you gotta be careful with how personal you get. I agree, Cheetos probably wouldn't work for me, although I do like Cheetos. But you can, if you're managing that tension right, it can be a winner. And you're touching these folks, 6, 7, 8 times through a variety of different channels. So you got the opportunity to mix it up. If you're hitting them with the same thing every time, the first time they look away, they're gonna look away every time from then on in. So.
And to take a different tact here is, a lot of what we are talking about is kind of that outbound motion. Right? You're making the effort, you're making the list, you're putting the messages together, you're sending stuff out. But I think some organizations have done a decent job of getting that inbound. So it's kind of like the difference in modality, how you treat those versus the stuff that's purely outbound. How do you go about that? And how do you maybe structure your organization to handle those more effectively?
And I got to be really careful with answering this question because all the experts on that are actually literally sitting in front of me, and they're much, much better at this than I'll ever be. But one of the things I've been with Believer for 6 months, and we have such an amazing inbound engine, and it's kudos to the folks in this room who manage that. And a lot of the customer-facing tone is one of help. It's all about how we're going to help you with your problem, help you with information, help you move through an evaluation process. So that tone in inbound obviously is right off the bat really a focus of ours, and I think it works really well. We get a lot of leads that convert. Now, I think you got to flex both muscles. I think your point is well taken. We've talked a lot about outbound. There's an outbound muscle you got to build as an organization as well. And, I think if you get both those things right, you can maximize the funnel.
Yeah, there's this interesting blog post that I always come back to where he makes a strong argument that you've got to build your product, you got to build your inbound, and then you build your outbound. I think a lot of people might disagree with that. There's a lot of different schools of thought, and I think there's a lot of differences in what your product is, how you sell it. But I think the big takeaway here, at least that I'm thinking of, is you definitely want to focus and get it right and really do a lot of testing, whether it's the inbound, the outbound. It's especially when you're a cash-strapped startup. If you're trying to do all at once, it can be pretty rough. And from what hanging out at enterprise sales, I know there's a lot of startup folks here, or CEOs and founders. So it's important to understand your personas, your deal sizes, where you're headed, and if you want to focus on each one of those. Some interesting things about inbound as well. I'm not an inbound expert, I'm more of an outbound expert, but what I've seen with inbound is that a lot of people just treat it reactively, not proactively. So inbound comes in, okay, let's respond. Obviously you want to respond fast, but with, like, for example, larger deal size or more complex deals, like if an inbound lead comes in, it's like, get them on the phone, don't just show up and like give them a demo or whatever. You might want to bring some more stakeholders and like treat it a little outbound like. I've seen that be more successful. So when inbound comes in, it might not necessarily be the best to just treat it like gold, like, oh, this is the greatest thing ever. There's a lot that you might have to discover and sort of push that one.
Right, so in a sense, think a little bit more expansively. Don't just focus in on that one particular contact. Maybe be a little bit more proactive and find some other contacts kind of near that person. And you start to build a coalition, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, we know the data says that in any deal today, there's 5 to 6 decision makers that are part of that decision-making group. So the sooner that you can engage them, especially if you're seeing interest, the more likely you're going to be to win the deal. And that could be a set of questions that you ask around who else is involved in this decision and how you build relationships with those folks. It could just be research that you're doing and having an outbound engine on an inbound lead, meaning you get the inbound, but you're doing outbound to folks who could be in the decision-making group to bring them along. I've seen that work pretty well.
Yeah, I think particularly in the bigger deals, I mean, whether you use like ABM, account-based marketing type methodologies, or whether you just call it selling to big accounts, the idea that you have all these people you're trying to build relationships with helps a lot, particularly in the enterprise space. I want to take a pause here just to see, are there any questions you have? Definitely, I think I saw some hands a little bit tepidly raised, but
I saw
you
Nolan
want to dig
raise his
in.
hand earlier. I don't know if he still Phil has a question.
Well, it was a straightforward question to one of your first points, which you mentioned something about them speaking about the competition. I just wanted to clarify, they reached out to you and spoke about your competition or their own competition that may be also reaching out to you. So I wasn't sure which you were referring to.
Yeah, in that particular case, and earmuffs guys, but it was Informatica, and they came out and said, listen, we've got this information on this competitor Informatica, and they had done their due diligence around, literally who I sit up thinking about most nights, right? So, yeah, that's right. So my competition, but they had a point of view, which was going to be valuable for me, and it got my attention.
Yeah, please.
So what percentage of the time do you think when you're setting up an appointment, you basically have it locked in, what percentage of the time do you ask for more stakeholders and what do you think it should be?
Let me repeat the question so you get it on the video. So you make a good point, Evan. It's not just about that one meeting, that one call you get, but also think about bringing stakeholders in at some point in the sale. So when do you think is appropriate to broach that?
I personally like to have a discovery call and get qualification and understand the dynamic, but that next call, if we're doing a demo, coming out of a discovery call, you're asking, who else can we bring to this conversation as part of the decision-making group? And that would be a place where I would typically bring more people in.
And maybe we could dig in a little bit in that, just because obviously, part of the struggle is just getting that first call.
Yeah, sure.
But how do you actually execute that call? How do you run it so you get the second and the third and the fourth? Because obviously we're talking about building pipeline. We got to do a few things very effectively, and we only have a short amount of time, not a lot of credibility to do it.
Well, and the counterpoint to that is you don't want to push a lot of first calls forward. So a lot of what you're doing in a first call is qualifying out.
Really good point.
Yeah, so I think for us, it's a little bit different in each environment because, demand is different and the degree to which you actually have, meetings hitting the books is different. But, for us, there's a fair amount of qualifying out that we're doing in those conversations to understand, hey, is this person in a buying window? Do we need to put them back in the nurture? How do we want to serve them? For me, as I think about a great first conversation, you need to be thinking about their business. You need to be coming in with a point of view. People they throw the word insight around a lot. I know that's a catchphrase, right? And for good reason. I think what we see is that if you're bringing ideas to customers, they're naturally going to be more engaged. But I also think, the art of asking great questions and having those questions make the customer think about their business and their problem is equally, if not more important. So if you're doing qualification right, and you're getting the customer engaged around ideas that matter to them, and if you're asking great questions that pique their interest, so that's a recipe for a great second call.
There's a couple great books out there that I would recommend that can help you run a great call for the 80% of the calls out there. Spin Selling and The Challenger Sale. How many people have heard of those books? Yeah, cool. All right, so you probably already read it. But one way that we've standardized calls and a lot of activities for the portfolio companies is through Spin Selling. There's also this guy named Barry Ryan, I don't know if you've heard of him, and Associates, and he kind of has this takeoff of Spin Selling where it's, spin stands for situation, problem, interest, or like impact, and then like the net outcome. And so expanding on that a little bit, it's like, okay, well, what's your situation? What's going on there, right? So you open the call with that, and then it's like, okay, well, that's your current situation. Tell me about the problems you're facing, right? So I'll tell you about that. Open-ended questions, right? That's a classic sales playbook piece. And then it's like, okay, well, if we could, tell me about your ideal situation. If we could get rid of that problem, what would that look like, right? Oh, well, it'd be implementing Salesforce, or it'd be, adding more activities to our sales team, something of that sort. And then you would say, okay, well, what if we could give you that ideal, right? And then they're like, okay, that'd be great. You're kind of soft closing them, and then they're really interested, they're hooked in. And then after that, it's a matter of kind of coming up with a mutual action plan, right? And then essentially bringing your pitch. So your pitch is at the end, but those are some kind of classic basics of running a call and getting pretty much hitting all those marks, getting the decision makers potentially brought into next calls. So that's kind of a high impact punch of like, all right, here's how you run a call. Here's what accomplishes most of those pieces in the sales process from,
see happening with people who are early in the game, less experienced. We don't realize how many calls, how many people, how you often go over the same thing again and again. I always feel it's like you're the conductor of orchestra, and you've got all these different groups. And I see people getting discouraged way too early. And I think, I would always emphasize, you just don't realize how long it's gonna take to get to yes.
Yeah, there's like that style, like 12 touches or 12 interactions for big enterprise deals before you get anywhere, let alone close.
And then
Yeah,
like multiples of that. Okay, question, York.
Going back to when reading those emails, a number of CEOs I spoke to said the emails they open are when they have a great title that catches their attention. When I say to CEOs, it's for about 2 or 3. So to what extent do you A, agree with that? And B, if you do have the ad and you tried out anything which has been successful?
When you're cold emailing a CEO?
Well, you're probably emailing in.
That's a good point, because I think a lot of times we talk about people that we're reaching out to that probably more tactically oriented, more on the grounds company, more hands-on. But if you're trying to reach out to a CEO, CTO, CFO, whatever it may be, the head of the business unit they're trying to sell into, it's probably a very different conversation. How do you grab their attention?
If I knew, I wouldn't be sitting here, on a beach somewhere.
Come on, man, need the secrets. Yeah, I can share just one thing that's kind of worked recently. We'll have some knowledge here. There's something in this mind of mine, but the thing is that you got to make it. We talked about relevancy, but the things that are relevant for particularly a C-level executive are much more strategic, and they're not risk-oriented. So you got to understand that there's different levels of risk or tolerance for risk in organizations. So someone on the ground, they may be a little bit more scrappy. Someone who's middle management, they're not going to want necessarily new ideas. They're not thinking that way. They're trying to keep the bus rolling. But someone who has to basically innovate, do digital transformation, have these big global initiatives, like they're thinking on a whole different level. So they are actively looking for ideas. So that's the first thing you got to think about. That's why I spend time reading things like annual reports. So you can dig in and understand at a strategic level, what is the CEO thinking about? What is the board thinking about? What are those objectives, and how does that actually play into what the other executives are going to be tasked with? And if you could create a message, like a subject line around that. A good example is I reached out to the CEO of TD Bank. And I saw that he made a comment about investing in AI and made a recent acquisition of a company. Now, he didn't respond back, but he's opened that email a few times. So I noticed some interest, right? And I use that over a series of emails with interesting information that I can share that shows I'm knowledgeable. And eventually, the hope is that he'll respond. And I have had CEOs respond to that type of highly personalized, highly relevant messaging.
I'm going to push back a little bit and say that, and ask, how often does the CEO actually make the end buying decision or actually implement stuff? And yeah, if it's a startup, I don't know what you sell, what you do, but if it's a startup, right, the CEO is doing everything. But if it's a larger company, the CEO, again, piggybacking off your thoughts, they're strategic, they're looking ahead. And in a lot of cases, what I've seen is, reach out to the CEO, but ask for the referral, right? Like classic playbook of Aaron Ross, predictable revenue, and then they point you to the person who's actually going to move that project forward. So I'm going to push back. Again, I don't know what you do, but I don't really see CEOs making the actual gears turning, right?
No, I agree with you. Most of the time, I agree. When you go to CEO, it's usually you want the CEO to say, go and speak to Mark. So Mark's more likely to speak to him.
Without seeking seal of approval.
Yeah.
Exactly. I guess what. Sorry. Yeah. I guess what I was trying to ask, whenever you're emailing anybody in the senior management, you're getting a lot. Your senior management, you're getting a lot of emails coming in. You want to stand out. It's the same thing when you're on the phone. You want to be quick. So I I'm just curious if you've had any like titles or headings that really caught that.
Yeah, there maybe some stories or things that you kind of reached out to a senior executive that was novel or interesting that got their attention, got a response.
I don't know what sort of novel and interesting. There's two things I think for me that are important. So senior executives and definitely CEOs have a much smaller peer group. So what I have found to work is sharing not my perspective, but the perspective of their peers. So, we talk to a lot of CEOs, we talk to a lot of heads of IT. Here's what we find, and guess what? It aligns to a strategic priority that you happen to have in your annual report. So, that type of message, when it's not me talking about how great I am, but their peers talking about how great what I can do for you will end up, driving value for you, whatever it might be. That can be pretty effective. So that's sort of one thing. I tend to agree with you on the CEO as the buyer. It's pretty rare. I do like the idea that they're going to push you to the right person, but the aspiration of getting in front of 20 CEOs this year is going to be a lot of work and probably not the outcome that you want. So.
Yeah, you spend the time where you're going to get the most bang for the buck, and it may not be prospecting at the highest levels of the organization.
One thing I could add a little bit tactical here is job changes. So especially if you use like LinkedIn or LinkedIn Sales Navigator, you can actually like follow people. It's kind of creepy when they change jobs. It's like, so when somebody comes into a new job or gets promoted, you can reach out and say, hey, what are your new objectives? And that's just a dead easy way of potentially getting in the door, especially if it aligns with what their thoughts might be. Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
And take advantage of that while you can, because a year from now, everyone who has a sales role is going to be running that play. And you're going to, these executives moving jobs are going to have 100 emails in their inbox. So the half-life on that, I think, is now. So do that now, and I think a year from now, you may find it's a little bit less effective.
Yeah, always try to mix up your game. If you stick with the same play, yeah, it's going to get old real quick. There's emails that I've seen that you see on like sales hack or whatever, and then I'm seeing those emails in my inbox like literally the next day. So try and be different. One actually, we'll get to your question, Eric, in a little bit, but I want to actually talk about the fact that it's great that you qualify, get that first call, you say, okay, they're in, let's develop this. But a lot of stuff in people's pipeline, I think, can be, I guess maybe nicely put as creative fiction. So how do you actually try to develop those things in the pipeline that are going to be real? I mean, are there markers or ways that you're trying to keep the momentum going?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, one thing that my mind goes right to that I've seen clear like uptick from with like being accountable and being able to instantly see that without listening to the rep's mouth is adding in more fields in my CRM that were required. And what I mean by that, for example, is when you're filling out your notes from the meeting, it's like, okay, well, was there, there's the classic abbreviation BANT, right? Budget, authority, need, time. So there's many variations of that. Basically, do those notes look good? Are they convincing? Did you actually take notes? And do those notes look like, okay, there's actually some next steps, there's a mutual action plan, there's a timeline here. So that's just a dead easy way of looking at a rep's pipeline, getting a little granular in there, yes, but you can usually tell, like, okay, this is the real deal, things are moving, versus maybe they're fibbing a little bit. So that's one tactic.
Yeah, and I think aligned to that is how long has the deal been at a certain stage? I mean, if it's been in the stage for 30 days and we haven't talked to them, or 45 days and we haven't talked to them, it's not a deal. So let's talk to them and see if there's a deal there, right? And whether that's asking the rep to do that, or asking someone else in the organization to do that, or reaching out yourself as a leader. Any one of these deals for us is pretty significant. So, we've got a great program where we've got, great folks who are engaged with those deals that maybe have, been on the vine a little while to make sure, hey, are these real? Should we focus there? Or should we get them back into a marketing channel? And at the same time, if deals are later in the pipeline, we have, our chief revenue officer or me doing direct outreach to have those conversations to figure out if they're real. So that's a good test for me.
And what about just from the rep level, maybe some early warning signs that maybe like, things aren't necessarily going in the right direction. Because I think a lot of times we have, in our minds, we hear a lot of yes, yes, yes. Maybe not necessarily a lot of critical thinking. Like, why are they interested? Why? So, the things that maybe you could do as preventative, just thought exercises or exercise just to prevent yourself from getting too sucked into hearing a lot of yes.
Yeah, I think you've got to manage it a little bit because, as salespeople, we've got to be optimistic, for a bunch of reasons. We have to be customer-facing, optimistic, and frankly, we have a hard job. And, if you're in sales, you've got a tough job. I think the question that I like to ask on deals is, why are we going to lose this deal? Because if you can figure out the answer to why you're going to lose, then all of a sudden you can put a strategy against it and try to solve that problem. And as opposed to what typically happens when I'm catching up with sellers, we want to talk about why we're going to win the deal because we're naturally optimistic. So that question I find to be really effective. You can ask that of yourself. You can ask that in a one-to-one. You can ask that in a forecast call. It works pretty well.
Yeah, question over here.
Question, maybe more comment. So a while back, you can clarify, you sent out an email from James Spear. It was all about cognitive and knowledge questions and being on a spectrum of how you ask them. And I think in terms of trying to make sure that your pipeline is viable and clean and not necessarily full of useless opportunities is to ask the right questions at the beginning. And a lot of them would be making sure that you're not only asking things that require more CPU thoughts from the people that you're trying to actually ask those questions. And if they can't answer them, it's probably not the right people to be asking them. And one of the questions, for pure examples, if you're looking to use in practice, as you're, a question like, as you reflect on possible trade-offs or compromises, how will you determine which elements will be the most important? So those are really asking deeper questions. I mean, it was a while back, can you share that again?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So just, think about the questions, having a methodology or process by which you would ask questions, super, super important. And to be a little bit more pragmatic about it. And just don't try and come up 3 minutes before your call, I'm not going to look stressed out, these are the questions I'm going to ask. I mean, I think we've all seen reps, and I think we've also been guilty of that as well. But there's a few folks that I look up to who I think have a really good perspective on it. One is James Muir, who's he has a really great blog, a lot of really great content, and I'll definitely share in the recap email after this wonderful event. I'll share that actual post because it was one I thought was really high quality. And I do share a lot of stuff in the Enterprise Sales Forum newsletter, so if you aren't receiving that, definitely sign up on our website. But about questions. How do you think about structuring? I mean, it's not, we're not trying to do a strict call script, particularly if you're selling something which is complex at the enterprise level. But how do you actually kind of plan out those calls?
Yeah, again, and I mentioned this earlier, I think the easiest framework and most effective that I've seen is really structuring around what's this prospect's situation and really understanding that. What is their problem? What is their ideal? And as it relates to your conversation, and if we can help you solve that, okay, let's work through that together now. And I think the one thing that reps miss is they stop at one. And what I mean by that is they stop and they tick off that box of, okay, I asked that question. They don't layer it. They don't go deeper. Tell me more. Well, why is that? Why is that? And it's also kind of the idea of selling through curiosity and just being really curious. Oh, really? What? Tell me about that. Being really interested, being in the moment, right? Not just thinking about, okay, tick that box. All right, next deal in my pipeline.
Yeah, it's like instead of interrogation, I need you to answer these 19 questions and all in a row. It's
Yeah, the best salesperson I know is my 4-year-old. Because all he'll do is ask me why all the time. And, we really get to the root of what the question is, right? So, that's, I always end up on, it's the universe. That basically is what I don't know. It just is. But, I think the other interesting thing, what I see a lot of sellers working to do is they've got a cadence they've been trained to do, a set of qualifying questions, and depending on where you are in the deal, you ask this kind of question, and it can feel a little bit robotic. And what I often, try to do and try to coach my team to do is, you got to ask those questions. You need to know who the economic buyer is, and you need to know what the time frame is. But if you frame it in the context of why it matters for the customer, it can be really powerful. So if you frame it in the context of, hey, I've had clients who have solved this problem, and here's the process they went through. Here are the things that they were thinking about. Here's the timeline, the time it took. Let's talk about how this looks relative to you, and you're kind of teaching around a buying process and getting the information that you need, as opposed to peppering them with sales process questions, which after about 30 seconds, their eyes glaze over and they don't want to talk to you anymore. I think it's just a nuance, but it can be really powerful.
Yeah, I think part of our title is actually building rapport, right? So it's you gotta get the answers to the questions, but also not do it in such a way that you're creating some distance. You're creating a really awkward situation.
Yeah, one thing Jason made me think of too that I want to build on is just interactivity. And even if you're thinking of just asking questions and they're doing all the talking, there's like these stats out there that Chorus and Gong say like, oh, you should only talk 40% of the time. But it's like, if we're having an interaction and it's kind of like a ping pong match, then more is going to get done and we're going to remember this conversation and good things are going to happen generally. So interactivity and just kind of being in the moment and being human is super helpful.
Actually, I think that's a really good point. I think we get caught up in this one thing, we need to talk less. No, you just need to actually say things that are impactful. But also, the other thing I've noticed is not talking over people necessarily. And one thing that I've found effective, I don't know if you found this effective, but incorporating a lot more pauses in the conversation. So don't just rush to answer something. Don't be reactive. Maybe let some things sit and percolate.
Yeah, I love uncomfortable silence on sales calls, actually, and it's pretty powerful. I count to 8. That's a good rule of thumb.
You'd be surprised how many people actually, you can just feel it's like they start paying attention again on the other side of that Zoom conference. They're just like, oh, yeah, that's totally true. And then here they are back in the meeting again, just from the pause. It's powerful.
Go, you get the comment?
Yeah, actually you mentioned Zoom, so that's a great segue to my question. So video versus audio. Do you tell your team to get on the video
Ooh,
as
yes.
possible, or
Yeah.
how do you get the other feedback?
Because I think we always talk about the phone, but video's become such a big thing now. So how do you get that? How do you do it?
For me, I don't know that we have a mandate either way. I think it's more what's comfortable for the customer. My view is the video can be really great for certain customers and actually creates a lot more personability, which is great. But for others, they're really thrown off by it. So I think it's a little bit of, it's tough to figure out who's who sometimes, but it's a mix for us.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was actually, this touches back, I'm going to answer your question, but there's also a question Mark had in the pamphlet briefing us before this about what's something crazy you've done prospecting-wise. And video was actually one of those things. I'll talk about that in a second. But with my last job at Lead IQ, our CEO mandated video on every meeting. And it was kind of a culture thing. Like Jason, like he's selling into finance, like Fortune 500, they probably got crazy security. So you can't always just do it, right? And that's probably a different culture. We were a startup, and it worked, and it was personable. Obviously, video is going to be more personable. You're talking with somebody, you see them, they see you. So I think if you can, you should do it. But if you're, be cognizant too. And again, what he said is like some people just might not be comfortable with that, and it could be bad. So use it with a grain of salt, I would say.
Follow-up, is it weird that if I turn on my video and they don't want to turn on theirs?
That's fine. Yeah, and I think alleviate it, right? Like be socially conscious and say, hey guys, like for example, my team, I remember there was a situation where that happened and the sales rep was like, I'm the only one here. I was like, yeah, just say something funny. And they're like, oh yeah, I just want to make sure you guys know I'm not a robot, right? It was just a funny moment, and I think them being more vulnerable actually helped the sale.
Well, in the context of building rapport, again, the topic of this talk, I think them seeing you naturally builds rapport. It's naturally more personal. And they may not turn their video on either, but the fact that they see you, all of a sudden it's a person, and they can relate, and all of a sudden they open up. I think that can be a really good tactic.
For sure, yeah. And one thing I want to touch back on that I think is a really fun tactic you guys should all try. So there's this tool called Vidyard Go Video. Have you guys heard of Vidyard?
Yeah.
So they have this free tool, Chrome extension, called Go Video. It used to be called Viewed It. And it's just a really easy screen share thing, screencast that's free, and it shows a video of you in the lower left. And you can just do these screencasts really easy and send it as a link, and it pops a thumbnail in the email, and so you can write a cold email with a thumbnail of you to that prospect, and it's super engaging. Like, who wouldn't click that? And so you can do fun things. You can do just video, and you can have, like, what they taught me is they'll get these little white handheld whiteboards, and they'll write the prospect's name. And so I tried this, wrote the prospect's name, sent this, and I got like a 40% response rate. It was crazy. It was great. So, and you can do all kinds of stuff.
Pretty cool story. I think also on the flip side, even if you feel a little bit hesitant about using video, just the video aspect itself, about how you actually speak and present yourself, you learn so much. Because that actually projects in when you do have those face-to-face meetings, or even on phone calls. So just being able to see yourself on video, even if you never want to send it out, I think video is like an awesome, awesome utility. Question right here.
All right, well, and we're talking about kind of wild or unique approaches and cadence about different ways to touch throughout. How often do you guys have your reps or your people send out maybe mailers? Because I've done some of that old school. I've done, one of the things that's been successful recently is sending like an emergency packet off to somebody and saying, hey, it's the cold season. You know, I hope this gives your immune system a boost. Maybe we can help boost your whatever it is that you're selling. Like that kind of creativity. You guys, it's kind of old school in the sense of like who writes a note and sends it. You know, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
What do you guys thought?
All sorts of crazy things. I mean, I've heard like some stories about sending like packages that are odd shaped, so it just stands out from like the person's desk. Like, oh, it's an odd shaped thing in the package, right? But yeah, anything that you kind of like thought of or seen. I'm actually curious. I mean, just be interactive. If you've done things, definitely share it because we can all learn from maybe some crazy or interesting tactics. Well,
Well, just from something that our company had done, it was more from our marketing team perspective, but they had a chief data governance book that they actually created and handed out to specific CEOs. So they targeted them, and actually we've had really positive feedback. I don't know the numbers on that at all, but it's been really
So post a selfie on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
yeah, I get it. You know, it's crazy. Here at Stack, like this logo is like, it's known by all developers around the planet. It's like amazing. So when I walk around like shows and stuff, it's like, hey, you're with Stack Overflow. And I've actually gotten emails back with customers that I send Stack shirts to, and they'll send me a photo of them in the t-shirt itself. It's like, hey, thanks for the t-shirt. This is awesome. So I think those things are definitely super awesome, huh?
Dennis, what are you gonna buy?
We'll get to that. We'll get to that later.
Yeah.
Come back, yeah, please.
What I typically do, and it has been pretty much like 90% successful, is take photos of myself at different venues, like the customer's venue. So if we're putting up Pizza Hut, going to Pizza Hut in Penn Station, take an extra like 5 minutes on my way home, and take a picture with like an employee buying a $10 or whatever pizza, Boston Market, Dunkin' Donuts, and then spinning it, whatever which way, based on news, based on whatever the product is. If there's, for example, Speedway, which is a gas station for those of you who don't have cars.
It's really Hess. It's not Speedway, it's Hess. Change your name.
No, they still have Speedways. So Speedway, the contact's name was Phil. So the picture was me filling up my boyfriend's car, and the joke was, I had to stop at Speedway to fill using his name, fill up the tank, and then I cracked the joke in parentheses, like, sorry, I had to, haha. And then I usually follow up with, doesn't Daily Pay and XYZ company make a good team? And pretty much every time you get a reply, and most of those replies are like, you're so ridiculous, like, I'll take a call. And I mean, honestly,
it's all about the outcome, right? That's all that matters.
It doesn't matter, yeah, it doesn't matter. And I think it's being genuine, it's being different, and most of them will specifically say in the response, like, that's so different, I've never been approached that way. I'll just have to call just for that reason. Like, no other reason, but this is totally ridiculous.
I love the idea of being able to personalize it, you know, add a little bit of humor, and it's not like the dumb, like, did you get eaten by an alligator? Adam hurt you. I mean, that's so like done. But making it personal about yourself and maybe being a little bit more vulnerable and introducing that's really cool. In the back, yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Tanya. I'm from Seamless Dots, and I have a question especially for you. When is it worthwhile actually personalizing it versus not personalizing it?
Yeah. So I do 600 new emails a day in outbound emails.
Wait, how many emails do you do a day?
600.
600. New contacts.
Each day. What ends up happening, because there's sequences, it's about 3,000 emails a day, 3% prospect, untold. But obviously for those, I'm not doing much personalization. However, on larger accounts, specifically those, so our product is focused on giving hourly employees access to their earnings prior to payday. So we work with, or we partner with corporations to offer this to their employees. So when an organization is hiring staff, has high turnover, any of that news or any of that is displayed in the news, we will target them. So Pizza Hut, back, I don't know, a couple months ago, they were hiring 10,000 new drivers by the end of the year. There was about a 3-month span before they were doing that. So there was like a perfect opportunity to reach out to them. So I head to Pizza Hut, I take a photo, and I send it off. The best subject line, I know you were asking about that, is appropriate person, which plays into what your thought is. I do email CEOs, CFOs, and those are the people that are responding, and or like drop it down a tier or two,
Right,
and then I'll get
down.
a response from them. But subject line appropriate person, and then the body is, hey, I heard, like I read recently, blah, 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 blah. Let me tell you how we can help you retain staff, hire staff, whatever, XYZ. I tie it in. Sometimes it's really nicely tied in, sometimes it's really loose and a far stretch, but, you know, make it work. And then it's, you know, if you're the appropriate person, when are you available this week, next week, depending on when I'm sending the email. If not, who can I speak to? And like I said, really successful in terms of getting responses.
Hey, you should join me here. We'll trade places. We should just like talk about that the rest of the evening. But I think that's really awesome. And it also makes a good point because we talk about like this idea of personalization, but there's probably layers of personalization. Like if we talk about CEO, that's super personalized. Talk about like some, you know, senior or middle managers, a little bit less personalized, which is kind of like rank and file. You might want to send out 600, you know, emails a day just to see who's going to pick up, who's going to respond. I mean, have you seen kind of that, or do you kind of score things that way?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's segmenting the account by value, right? So you're doing more for those in the account or higher value for you, but you still want the coverage. Yeah.
So any other kind of like, please check. Go for it.
So say you had an SDR set up your call, you've never talked to this person before. So your foot's in the door. How do you build rapport at the beginning of that call?
Right. So the classic gap between the SDR's had some, maybe one conversation, maybe a few conversations. Now it's time to pass it over to AE. It's kind of like you're starting from fresh, and from the buyer perspective, it's like, I thought I was dealing with that person, now it's this new person. So how do you handle that elegantly?
Yeah, so the handoff playbook that we had at my last company, Lead IQ, was SDR would be on that call. They would introduce that person. We were also using video on Zoom, so SDR, me, and the prospect. So it was very personal, and it was also, you know, kind of as a side note, helpful for the SDR if they had time to be on that call and to learn the AE interactions, because a lot of SDRs want to be AEs. So it kind of killed two birds with one stone. So the introduction was helpful. And one thing that we were super heavy on was like engagement in the beginning of the call, building rapport, and obviously there's a lot of ways to do that, but I think kind of being heavy on like, you know, just building that kernel of like, we're connecting, we're humans, talking about the weather, talking about hobbies, and just like understanding that's the reality. Like we're forming a new relationship right now. I'm a cold lead to you, so the AE and this prospect need to kind of like really become BFFs really fast. So kind of being a little heavy on that and pulling back, you know, leading in with questions and the sales conversation early on.
Yeah, the only thought I had on that, all those, I think, map well to what we try to do, but I think there's, you know, if you're doing it well, there's 5 minutes of prep before where the SDR and the AE are talking about what's going to happen on the call and what this prospect cares about. And then for me, it's, you know, what's the personal thing that's interesting that you can speak to, you know, what's the reference that you can speak to in terms of common people you know, and then what's the value that got this person to take the call. And if you can play that back at the start of the call, I think that naturally gets you into the right rhythm.
My tip, good notes in your CRM. Good notes, that's kind of like a sore point, and I'm not always the best at it either, but put the notes in the system. It'll make the handoff so much easier. I want to be respectful of time because we're kind of at the hour mark. Let me take one last question, maybe one last kind of lightning round. Is it a quick question?
Yeah, Jason, at what point are you sending your AEs out to actually get off internet, get off video, and actually go back to shaking hands? And
People meet people face to face. It is true. There are face to face meetings that happen these days.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think it is very much dependent on your sales cycle and your transaction size. So for us, our deals are 150 to 250K out of the gate. So that means that it's fairly complex. There's actually a number of face-to-face that we do. Generally, as we get through a good discovery call and we're getting into the point where they're doing a technical evaluation, we would do an on-site at that point. Okay. So they're highly qualified. We know they're in a buying window. They're evaluating our software, and we're there in front of them.
I'd say rarely do face-to-face in the initial stages of the process. Right. It's kind of, you're starting to verify and start to build that coalition, so you make a face-to-face worthwhile. I want to, if you have questions afterwards, we're going to be sticking around. But I want to just end with one last thought, which is like a book or just something that, just like a resource, whatever it may be that you thought you read recently that's been really inspiring or helpful from a sales or just a business perspective.
Well, mine were stolen already, and I think you referenced two great ones earlier. There's a great one by, blanking on his name right now, it's called Sales Simplified. I think it's, do you remember?
Yeah, Mike Weinberg.
Yeah, that's right, Mike. And so, I mean, what's really interesting about the book is, you know, I think with all of the research and all of the thought leadership out there, there's all these new ideas that are always coming about, but really sales comes down to doing some pretty straightforward things pretty well. So it's a nice touch point on what really matters, because you can get lost in a lot of what's out there. So I really enjoy that book. Just as a kind of a recap every 6 months, I take a stroll through that to get my bearings again.
You mentioned spin selling. What was the other one? And maybe like a
yeah. So for kind of beginning or individual contributors, spin selling. I mean managers too. Spin selling and the challenger sale. How many founders or CEOs are here? Few. Okay. So in your shoes, what I would recommend is there's one of two books or both. The Sales Acceleration Formula by Mark Roberge. That gives you the kind of whole gamut from a manager standpoint of sales, the HubSpot guy. And then the other one is from Impossible to Inevitable by Jason Lemkin and Aaron Ross. So those are great founder sales books.
I'm gonna actually, I rarely mention my my recommendation, but it's a book I'm reading now, and it also ties into our February event. It's a book called Financial Intelligence. One of the things I've started to notice is, as it gets more difficult to bring some of these larger deals in, there's more scrutiny. You're starting to see the CFO sometimes enter into the conversations or their staff. And people want to see proof in the pudding. They want to see financial justification for these large expenses. So we're going to actually have a session next month. We're going to invite some people in to share kind of how they build out that value mapping exercise tied to financial metrics and build a really strong business case that can help seal the deal when there's a lot of uncertainty and when people may look at what you're doing as a nice to have as opposed to something essential for the business. So definitely check out the February event, sign up for that. And if you do get a chance, I'm not saying it's going to be the most riveting read ever, but the information in this is, I mean, outstanding. And so if you're kind of new to it, like you don't really know like 10K reports or how to decipher some of the financial things or KPIs or DuPont formulas, those things, definitely get that book. With that, I just want to can we just give a round of applause to this awesome